History of the Chicago Cubs. The following is a franchise history of the Chicago Cubs of Major League Baseball, a charter member of the National League who started play in the National Association in 1870 as the Chicago White Stockings. The Chicago National League Ball Club is the only franchise to play continuously in the same city since the formation of the National League in 1876. They are the earliest formed active professional sports club in North America, predating the team now known as the Atlanta Braves by 1 year. In their early history, they were called in the press the White Stockings, Orphans, Infants, Remnants, and Colts before becoming Cubs in 1907. Chicago White Stockings / Chicago Colts. 1870, the Chicago White Stockings Baseball Club. The success and fame won by the Brooklyn Atlantics organized baseball's first true dynasty and the Cincinnati Red Stockings. Circa 1867 through 1870, baseball's first openly all-professional team led to a minor explosion of other openly professional clubs by the late 1860s, each with the singular goal of defeating the Red Stockings, who had accumulated an unparalleled 89-game winning streak. It was common at the time for sports writers to refer to teams by their uniform colors, and it happens that Chicago's club, which was officially known as the Chicago's Baseball Club, adopted white and were immediately tagged by reporters White Stockings. Played their first game against the Union Club of St. Louis and soundly defeated the Unions 7-1. The White Stockings divided their games between their downtown practice field, Ogden Park, and a larger facility set up at Dexter Park, where they hosted games to draw larger crowds. After some individually arranged contests using mostly the same roster, Chicago managed to put together a 10-man roster and joined the nation's top organized league, which was now allowing entry to professionals. This league, known as the National Association of Baseball Players, had been primarily dominated by the Atlantics, and until very recently, before the admitting of the Red Stockings and the White Stockings, had consisted of mostly baseball clubs from the New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. areas. Despite this East Coast dominance, Chicago won the NABBP championship that year, although the title was disputed by the opposing club, the New York Mutuals. 1871 through 1875, William Hulbert and the National Association. The following season, the time was right for the formation of the very first all-professional league, and thus the National Association of Professional Baseball Players was born, and the White Stockings, financed by businessman William Hulbert, became charter members of the new league. After their experiment with a racetrack in 1870, the White Stockings returned to the downtown for 1871, a decision that would prove fateful. The club arranged with the city to build a ballpark in the northeast corner of the public park, then known as Lake Park, later named Grant Park. The venue was dubbed the Union Baseball Grounds, and the club was a close contender for the pennant until late in the season. On Sunday, October 8th, the Great Chicago Fire erupted on the near south side and swept northward through the downtown. The wooden ballpark was right in the firestorm's path, and the grounds and all the team's equipment and uniforms were consumed. Despite that disaster, the White Stockings played their 1871 season to completion on the road in borrowed uniforms. They managed to finish second, just 2 games short of the title that was won by Philadelphia. Despite the strong finish, the club was compelled to drop out of the league during the city's recovery period until ultimately being revived in 1874 and moving into the newly built 23rd Street grounds on the near south side. Although the original Red Stockings had disbanded after 1870, many of the players became members of a new club wearing similar uniforms but now based in Boston. Over the next 4 seasons, the Boston Red Stockings dominated the National Association and hoarded the game's best stars, even those under contract with other teams. Holbert, the White Stockings Club president, was disgusted by the lack of enforceable contracts. The most famous of these contract jumpers or revolvers was Davy Force, as well as the monopoly of the Boston Club and the league's inability to enforce a mandatory schedule. Gambling and alcohol were also seen as serious problems, with games too often being suspected of being thrown. As a result, Holbert spearheaded the formation of a new, stronger, more ethical organization. During the last years of the NA, Holbert worked behind the scenes to convince the owners of the St. Louis Browns, Hartford Dark Blues, Philadelphia Athletics, and a few others to join the White Stockings in his new league, which would be known as the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs. The National League's formation meant the end of the NA, as its remaining clubs shut down or reverted to amateur or minor status. 1876 through 1900, the National League. After the 1875 season ended, Holbert was principal in the acquisition of several key players, including Boston pitcher Albert Spalding and first baseman Adrian Anson of the Philadelphia Athletics. The club continued to play its home games at 23rd Street. With the pieces in place, the Chicago National League Ball Club quickly established themselves as one of the new National League's top teams. Spalding won 47 games that season, and James Deacon White and Ross Barnes, also brought in by Holbert, were major contributors as well, as Barnes hit .429 that season, and White, one of the last great barehanded catchers, led the league in RBI. The White Stockings cruised through the National League's inaugural season of 1876, winning the league's first championship. Near the end of the season, Mutual of New York and Athletic of Philadelphia, who were remnants of the NA, dropped out of contention and refused to play the remainder of their respective schedules. Holbert flexed his executive muscle, expelling both franchises from the league. Despite Holbert's attempt to make Chicago the overpowering team that Boston had been during the NA years, the next season found Chicago finishing a disappointing 5th in the 16 league, behind a resurgent Boston entry, another NA carryover in the 60-game season. In 1878, the club arranged with the city to build a new Lake Park ballpark in essentially the same place as the 1871 ballpark. Chicago improved over the next 2 seasons as the schedules grew to around 75 or more games. In 1880, the White Stocking won 67 and lost 17 for an all-time NL record, .798 winning percentage. Cap Anson and a Chicago dynasty. Adrian Anson, the team's best player and perhaps the greatest ball player in the early era of professional baseball, became the club's captain and was so much identified as the face of the club he became better known as Cap Anson. After the 1876 pennant, which at the time was the game's top prize, Anson led the team to a great amount of success in the early season, and long travel times between games at the time was such that most teams got by with two principal starters, and Chicago had two very good ones in Larry Corcoran and Fred Goldsmith. Corcoran, who won 43 games in 1880 through three no-hitters in the early part of the decade, a record that would stand until being broken by Sandy Koufax in 1965. Goldsmith is one of two pitchers credited with the invention of the curveball. The two were baseball's first true pitching rotation. In 1882, Holbert died suddenly, and A.I. Spalding, who had retired a few years earlier to start Spalding Sporting Goods, assumed ownership of the club, with Anson acting as first baseman and manager. That season was also the first for the American Association, the self-proclaimed Beer and Whiskey League, which began play as a second major league. The AA offered alcohol and Sunday games, moves which forced the more traditional NL into challenges that likely would not have been made had Holbert lived. Chicago played an unauthorized two-game postseason series against the AA champions, the Cincinnati Reds. Each team won one of the two games. The White Stockings slipped a bit in 1883, finishing 4 games behind Boston. For 1884, the club made a ground rules change at their home ballpark. Its dimensions, especially right field, were very cozy. Perhaps less than 200 feet from home plate, fly balls hit over the right field fence were previously ruled doubles, but in 1884 they were to be ruled as home runs. The batters began aiming for right field and set some very dubious home run records that would last for decades until the modern lively ball era began. This change hurt more than it helped, as the club finished 22 games off the pace. For 1885, the city reclaimed its lakefront land, and the club went looking for a new home. They found a lot available on the near west side and began building, finally opening West Side Park 1 in June. The White Stockings, despite being vagabonds for their first 2 months, played strong and won the NL pennant by 2 games over the New York Giants. Meanwhile, the St. Louis Browns easily won the first of what would prove to be 4 consecutive pennants as they dominated the AA. Chicago appeared ready to return to the top in 1885. The Chicago Stone Wall, the greatest infield of its day, was in place, anchored by Anson and Ned Williamson, who hit 27 home runs in 1884, 25 at home, 2 on the road, a record which would stand until being broken by Babe Ruth in 1919. King Kelly was the best catcher in the league, and Corcoran was primary pitcher, but John Clarkson, a product of an Anson scouting trip, would lead Chicago to yet another pennant. Much has been written about old Hoss Radbourn's record, 60 victories for the Province Grays of 1884, but Clarkson won an amazing 53 games in 1885, despite second to Corcoran in the rotation. Anson considered the 1885 to 86 teams the best he managed. During this period, Anson became the first ball player credited with achieving 3,000 hits. Anson's actual number of hits varies depending on the source. MLB itself recognizes Anson as having over 3,000 hits. His run-producing prowess led the Chicago Tribune to propose a new stat, runs batted in. It would take years to become official, but research would reveal that Anson led the NL in RBI 8 times, still the major league record. Anson's influence on the team is likely greater than that of any other single player's influence on any professional sports team, perhaps only rivaled by what Ruth would eventually become to the New York Yankees 3 decades later. Anson's Anson's mark was so deep that by the mid 1890s, sports writers had dropped the White Stockings name in favor of the Chicago Colts, or more commonly, Anson's Colts. Anson is also given the credit or the blame for setting the stage for the longest lasting version of the color line, barring African Americans from Major League Baseball. In an August 10, 1883 exhibition game against the then independent Toledo Blue Stockings, who would before the next season join the American Association, Anson refused to field his team as long as Toledo's catcher Moses Walker, who was black, was in the lineup. Anson claimed that Walker was ineligible to play because the rules then in effect permitted only gentlemen to play, and Walker as a black person was incapable of satisfying the definition of a gentleman. The umpires disagreed and threatened both to grant the Blue Stockings a victory by forfeit and to deprive Anson and his team of their share of the day's ticket sales unless Anson and his team took the field. Anson relented and the game went on with Walker in the Toledo lineup, but in an 1884 game against Toledo, by now affiliated with the AA and playing as the Mud Hens, Anson held his line and insisted that the arrangements for the game include a provision excluding black players from both teams' lineups. By the 1897 season, the leagues adopted an agreement that neither they nor their minor league affiliates would admit black players, establishing a racial barrier in professional baseball for the next half century. A postseason World Championship Series had been held in 1884 between the champions of the league, or Providence, and Association Metropolitan, and the White Stockings and the Browns arranged to continue that new tradition in 1885. This was the first meeting between Chicago and the St. Louis franchise that would eventually join the NL and become known as the St. Louis Cardinals. The two clubs remain perennial rivals. The 1885 series ended in dispute and with no clear resolution. Both clubs faced each other again in 1886, and this time around there was no question about the outcome, with the Browns winning the series 4-2. This marked the only AA win in the 19th Century World Series contest. Things changed with time for the White Stockings/Colts following Chicago's great run during the 1880s. The on-field fortunes of Anson's Colts dwindled during the mid-1890s, despite the emergence of Bill Lang, who set the club record for steals with 84 in 1897 and was one of the league's best hitters for 7 seasons. The club would have to await revival under new leadership, however, for in 1898, Spalding opted not to renew Anson's contract, and a year later, Lang retired to become a professional scout. Transition. Baseball's popularity in general faded somewhat during the 1890s. In an apparent effort to boost attendance, in 1891, the Colts began splitting their schedule between West Side Park and recently built South Side Park. In 1892, they played their entire schedule on the south side, but decided to move more toward the city center again. Early in the 1893 season, they opened West Side Park 2, a wooden structure that would be their home for the next 23 seasons. Anson's departure led to the team's nickname transitioning through the next few seasons. With the loss of their pop, as Anson had become known, at times, the media referred to the club as the Remnants or the Orphans. The Colts name remained in circulation through the 1905 season, along with Orphans and Remnants, depending on which newspaper or fan one spoke to. The name Cubs first appeared in print in 1902 and gained popularity over the next 4 years, before becoming the primary nickname in 1906 and acknowledged by the team itself in its 1907 World Series programs. The Cub in the Sea logo first appeared on uniforms in 1908 and the name Cubs the following year. With the purchase of the Cubs in 1906 by Charles Murphy, some local newspapers began calling the team Murphy's Spuds, or just the Spuds. That playful nickname eventually faded. The old name, Chicago White Stockings, was adopted in 1900 by the new American Baseball League entry on Chicago's South Side, initially as a minor league entry. The AL turned major in 1901, and the Southsiders' adopted nickname was soon shortened by the press to Chicago White Sox. Early MLB years, Dead Ball era, 1901 through 1913, a new Cubs dynasty. After the formation of the American League, Al Spalding gave up ownership of the club to concentrate on touring the country to promote his sporting goods company, selling the team to John Hart in 1902. Oddly, the team Spalding put together before he left was one of his grandest accomplishments. Joe Tinker, shortstop, Johnny Evers, second baseman, and Frank Chance, first baseman, were three Hall of Fame Cubs infielders who played together from 1903 to 1912. They, along with third baseman Harry Steinfeld and catcher Johnny King, formed the infield on what would become one of the most dominant baseball teams of all time. By 1905, the Cubs were owned by Charles Murphy, who purchased the franchise for $125,000. Chance took over as manager for the ailing Frank Steele in that year, and the Cubs responded by winning 4 pennants and 2 World Series titles over a 5-year span. Their record of 116 victories in a 154-game season in 1906 has not been broken, though it was tied by the Seattle Mariners in 2001 in a 162-game season. The 1906 Cubs still hold the record for best winning percentage of the modern era, with a .763 mark. However, they lost the 1906 World Series to their crosstown rival, White Sox. The Cubs again relied on dominant pitching during this period, featuring hurlers such as Mordecai Three-Finger Brown, Jack Taylor, Ed Rulbach, Jack Feister, and Orval. The Cubs' pitchers posted a record for lowest staff earned run average that still stands today. Rulbach threw a one-hitter in the 1906 World Series, one of a small handful of twirlers to pitch low-hit games in the postseason. Brown acquired his unique and indelicate nickname from having lost most of his index finger in farm machinery when he was a youngster. This gave him the ability to put a natural extra spin on his pitches, which often frustrated opposing batters. In 1907, the Cubs won 107 games, dominating the National League once again. That year, they met Ty Cobb and Detroit Tigers in the World Series, beating them 4-1 for the franchise's first World Series championship. At the time, a tie was replayed the next day from the beginning but counted in the series score, so officially the series was not a sweep. On September 23, 1908, the Cubs and New York Giants, involved in a tight pennant race, were tied in the bottom of the 9th inning at the Polo Grounds. The Giants had runners of first and third and 2 outs when Al Bridwell hit a single to center field. scoring Moose McCormick from third with the Giants' apparent winning run, but the runner on first base, rookie Fred Merkle, went halfway to second and then sprinted to the clubhouse after McCormick touched home plate. As fans swarmed the field, Evers retrieved the ball and touched second. A force out was called at second base, and since there were 2 outs, this ending the inning, negating McCormick's score from third. As the crowd was swarming the field and the players had decamped to their respective clubhouses, the umpires were unable to resume play and the game was declared a tie. The game went down in history as Merkel's boner. Because of the tie, the Giants and Cubs ended up tied for first place. The Giants lost the league's first one-game playoff, and the Cubs went on to the World Series, where they defeated the Tigers once again, this time 4-1, for their consecutive World Series championship. It would be their last World Series victory for 108 years. Tinker to Evers to Chance. Some experts believe the Cubs could have been in the series for 5 seasons had Johnny King not sat out the entire 1909 season. King temporarily retired to play professional pocket billiards, but his primary reason for not playing was most likely a contract dispute. His absence obviously hurt the stability of the pitching staff, as when he returned in 1910, the Cubs won the pennant again, although the veteran club was unable to defeat the young Philadelphia Athletics in the Fall Classic. During that 1910 season, the club's star infielders Tinkers, Evers, and Chance gained even more national acclaim after turning a critical double play against the New York Giants in a July game. The trio was immortalized in Franklin P. Adams' poem, Baseball's Sad Lexicon, which first appeared in July 18th of 1910 edition of the New York Evening Mail. These are the saddest of possible words: Tinker to Evers to Chance. Trio of bear cubs and fleeter than birds, Tinker and Evers and Chance. Ruthlessly pricking our gonfalon bubble, making a giant hit into a double. Words that are heavy with nothing but trouble, Tinker to Evers to Chance. Gonfalon is a poetic way of referring to the pennant that both clubs battled for. The expression Tinker to Evers to Chance is still used today and means well-oiled routine or a sure thing. Tinker and Evers reportedly could not stand each other and rarely spoke off the field. Evers, a high-strung, argumentative man, suffered a nervous breakdown in 1911 and rarely played that year. Chance suffered a near-fatal beaning the same year. The trio played together little after that. In 1913, Chance went to manage the New York Yankees, and Tinker went to Cincinnati to manage the Reds, and that was the end of one of the most notable infields in baseball. They were inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame together in 1946. Tinker and Evers reportedly became amicable in their old age, with the baseball wars far behind them. 1914 through 1924. Lasker, Wiegman, and the Double Bills. The Cubs fell into a lengthy doldrum after the departure of their stars. In 1916, advertising executive Albert Lasker and his partner Charles Phelps Taft obtained a large block of shares and soon acquired majority ownership of the Cubs. In 1916, Taft was brought out by Charlie Wiegman, who had owned the Chicago Whales of the short-lived Federal League and was proprietor of a popular chain of lunch counters. Wiegman and Lasker moved the Cubs to the Whales' old home, Wiegman Park, in 1916, The club was soon playing competitively again and won the NL pennant in the war-shortened season of 1918, where they played a part in other teams' curse of the Bambino. In the 1918 World Series, Northsiders, led by pitcher Grover Cleveland Alexander, posted the majors' best record at 84-45 that year and faced the Boston Red Sox. Babe Ruth won 2 games in the series, including a 1-10 complete game shutout in the opener to start off what would be a 6-game Boston triumph. Ruth was sold to the Yankees a year later, starting the Red Sox own tale of futility, which lasted for 86 years. The 1918 series was poorly attended, and there were rumblings that it was fixed, but with America's energy focused on World War I, nothing came of these suspicions. Following the 1919 Black Sox scandal, which led to yet another curse on the south side of Chicago, baseball in the city fell into very dark times, and Lasker worked to create a new governing authority for Major League Baseball that led to Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis becoming the first commissioner of baseball. By then, Weigman was out of the picture. His lunch counter business fell on hard times after the war, and he was forced to sell more and more stock to Lasker's friend, chewing gum magnate William Wrigley Jr. By 1918, Weigman had sold his remaining stock to Wrigley. In 1921, Wrigley bought Lasker's controlling stake as well. 1925 to 1946. Early Wrigley years, every 3 years. After buying the rest of Lasker's shares, Wrigley changed the name of the team's home ballpark to Wrigley Field in 1925 in order to generate more exposure for his brand of chewing gum. This is one of the earliest examples of corporate sponsorship. Wrigley also acquired the services of astute baseball man William Veeck Jr. or Sr., appointing him as club president. Veeck had been a sports writer and had criticized Cubs management. In an unusual move, Wrigley challenged Veeck to see if he could do better. It proved to be a good move. With Wrigley's money and Veeck's savvy, the Cubs were soon back in business in the National League, the front office having built a team that would be strong contenders for the next decade. Hack Wilson, Gabby Hartnett, Billy Herman, Rogers Hornsby, and many other stars donned Cub uniforms during that stretch, and they achieved the unusual accomplishment of winning a pennant every 3 years, 1929, 1932, 1935, and 1938. Unfortunately, their success did not extend to the postseason, as they failed to their American League rivals each time, often in humiliating fashion. One example was in Game 4 of the 1929 World Series, when the Cubs, leading 8-0 at the time, yielded 10 runs to the Philadelphia Athletics in the 7th inning. A key play in that inning was center fielder Hack Wilson losing a fly ball in the sun, resulting in a 3-run inside the park homer. In the 1932 World Series, Babe Ruth again torched the Northsiders, though this time with his bat, when he led New York in a series in which he hit his famous called shot home run in Chicago during Game 3. The Yankees then went on to a 4-game sweep of the Northsiders. There were some historic moments for the Cubs as well, as they won the 1935 pennant in thrilling fashion. Billy Herman hit a career-best .341 and led the Cubs to 21 straight wins in September, which propelled the club to the 1935 World Series, where they fell to Hank Greenberg's Detroit Tigers in a hard-fought 6-game series. The 1938 season saw Dizzy Dean lead the team's pitching staff and provided an historic moment when they won a crucial late season game with a walk-off home run by player-manager Gabby Hartnett, which became known in baseball folklore as the Homer in the Gloamin'. However, Chicago fell to the Yankees again in the 1938 World Series. By this time, the double Bills had both died, and the front office, now under P.K. Wrigley, was unable to rekindle the success his father had created, and so the team would slip into its first period of mediocrity. The curse of the Billy Goat. The Cubs enjoyed one more pennant at the close of another world war, led by outfielder Andy Pafko and infielder Phil Cavarretta. Due to the wartime travel restrictions, the first 3 games were played in Detroit, where the Cubs won 2 of them, and the last 4 were played at Wrigley. The Cubs won game 19-0, and Claude Passaw tossed a one-hitter in Game 3 to give the Northsiders a 2-1 advantage as the series to Wrigley Field. In Game 4, the curse of the Billy Goat was laid upon the Cubs when Philip K. Wrigley ejected Billy Sianis, who had come to the game with 2 box seats tickets, one for him and one for his goat. They paraded around for a few innings, but ultimately Wrigley demanded the goat leave the park due to complaints about its unpleasant odor. Upon his ejection, an angry Sianis uttered, "The Cubs, they ain't gonna win no more," and his family said he then sent a telegram to the Cubs owner saying that they would never win another pennant or World Series. The Cubs lost Game 4, and despite a heroic series by Cavarretta, lost the 1945 World Series in 7 games. Although the Cubs occasionally appeared in postseason series since divisional play began 1969, they did not win a pennant or win a World Series again until 2016. The 1945 season actually followed 5 consecutive losing seasons. The Cubs posted only 11 winning seasons, and 6 of them were consecutive from 1967 to 1972, during which the career of Mr. Cub, Ernie Banks, ended. Late Wrigley years, 1947 to 1981. 1947 to 1981, the Dark Ages. After the curse of the Billy Goat, a few years into the post-World War II era, astute observers of the game began to suspect that something had gone wrong with the Cubs franchise, and that it might take them a long time to recover. In his 1950 book, The World Series and Highlights of Baseball, Lamont Buchanan wrote the following prose next to photos of Wrigley apparently taken during the 1945 World Series and of their newly hired manager. From the sublime to last place, Wrigley Field, the ivy of its walls still whispering of past greatness, watches its Cubs grow less ferocious in 47, 48, 49. New doctor of the cure is smiling Frank Frisch, veteran of previous baseball transfusions, who thinks it's nice to have the fans with you. Chicago has a great baseball tradition. The fans remember glorious yesterdays as they wait for brighter tomorrows, and eventually their Cubs will bite again. Little did anyone realize how long eventually would turn out to be. After losing the 1945 World Series, the Cubs finished 82-71. Good for third place in 1946, but did not enter postseason play. The following year, however, the Cubs slumped to 69-85 and 6th place. The Cubs would spend most of the next 2 decades buried deep in the bottom half of the National League. From 1947 to 1966, the Cubs only managed a .500 record twice. Many of those teams lost over 90 games, and in 1962, and 1966 they lost over 100. All this futility came despite the excellent play of shortstop Ernie Banks, who became known as Mr. Cub. Finding help for Banks, however, turned out to be the team's downfall. Players such as Hank Sauer and Ralph Kiner found only temporary homes in Chicago during the early 1950s, and Phil Cavaretta's numbers tailed off late in his career. Incidentally, Cavaretta, who played 20 seasons for the Cubs and had been player/manager, was fired during spring training of 1954 after admitting the team was unlikely to finish above fifth place. They finished seventh. One of Wrigley's attempts to right the ship actually set the team further back. In December 1960, he announced the Cubs would no longer have a manager. Instead, an 8-member college of coaches would run the club. The 8 men would rotate all the way through the Cubs organization so that every player from Class D, equivalent to today's rookie leagues, on up would learn a standard system of play. Each coach would serve as head coach of the Cubs during his tenure there. This approach could be considered visionary in that it anticipated the coaching specialization that has evolved in the modern game. However, this experiment proved to be poorly executed. There was no real pattern to the rotation, and each coach brought a different playing style. Some talent finally returned to the North Side during this era, in the form of third baseman Ron Santo and outfielder Billy Williams, the 1961 National League Rookie of the Year. However, without consistent leadership in the dugout, the Cubs remained buried in the second division. They only had one winning record during the 4-year experiment, never finished higher than seventh, and got no closer than 17 games out of first. This stretch also saw some of the worst teams in Cubs history. The 1962 season, for instance, saw the team lose 103 games, the most in franchise history. There was also a racial factor in the rotation, as Buck O'Neil was one of the coaches, but was never promoted to the head coach position. Wrigley finally relented and named one person as sole head coach in 1963, but did not completely scrap the experiment until Leo DeRocher took over in 1966 and emphatically declared himself manager with Wrigley's support. In the mid-1960s, the Cubs began showing signs of life, sparked by Banks, Williams, and Santo, and the emergence of ace pitcher Ferguson Jenkins. In 1967 and 1968, the club put together its first back-to-back winning seasons since 1945 to 1946, making fans hopeful for a spectacular 1969 season. Fall of 1969. In 1969, the Cubs started out 11-1, building a substantial lead in the newly created National League East. Chicago surged through the All-Star break, led by the quartet of eventual Hall of Famers in Banks, Jenkins, Santo, and Williams. Jenkins ultimately won 21 games. Bill Hand was also a 20-game winner, and Ken Holtzman won 17, which included a no-hitter on August 19th. Chicago led the division by 8.5 games over St. Louis and by 9.5 games over the New York Mets in late August, but the Cubs wilted under pressure, losing key games to the Mets, and finished at 92-70, 8 games out of the first. Many superstitious fans attribute this collapse to an incident at Shea Stadium on September 9th when a fan released a black cat onto the field, thereby further cursing the club. Others have stated the sheer number of day games that the Cubs had to play contributed to the disaster. Chicago, bearing near Lake Michigan, boasts summers which are quite humid, 85 degrees to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 to 32 degrees Celsius on average. And playing in this heat day after day might have taken its toll. From August 14th through the end of the season, the Mets, who played mostly night games, had an amazing 38-11 record, finishing with 100 wins, while the second place Cubs slumped in September, going only 8-17. 1970 through 1981, bad teams and the June swoon. In the decade of the 1970s and through the 1983 season, the Cubs tasted few substantial successes. Following the disastrous 1969 campaign, the Cubs fell into mediocrity, finished slightly over .500 in 1970, 1971, and 1972, while they still had most of the core players from the 1969 team in uniform, including the old guard and Santo and Williams on the field, and Jenkins, Holtzman, and Milt Pappas, who tossed a no-hitter in 1972, on the mound. No Cub would again pitch a no-hitter until Carlos Zambrano on September 15, 2008. After 1973, however, the bulk of those core players were either retired or were traded, and the Cubs sank to the bottom of the National League East pecking order. Between 1973 and 1983, they were a combined 165 games under .500. It was during this entire decade of poor baseball that the term "lovable losers" became a catchphrase, since the fans were still coming out to see the team despite the dreadful quality of the on-field product. Phil Wrigley died in 1977, leaving the team to his son, William Wrigley III. This year saw the Cubs' best finish in the 1970s, but even this was a testament to the team's futility during the dark ages, as all-star Bobby Mercer led the baby blue pinstriped 77 club into first place at 47-22. By June 28th, and the team enjoyed an 8.5 game lead in the NL East after entering the All-Star break at 54-35, still an impressive 19 games above .500. The team started to crack as the Philadelphia Phillies picked up steam, cutting the Cubs' division lead to only 2 games. As the summer progressed, the Cubs spiraled out of contention, playing poorly in August and ending the season with a streak in which they lost 17 of 22 games, ultimately finishing at 81-81, a staggering 22 games behind Philadelphia. Amazingly, the club then had similar, though not as exaggerated, falls in the 2 subsequent campaigns, despite the acquisition of slugger Dave Kingman. The Cubs were as many as 11 games over .500 in 1978 and peaked at 13 over in 1979, but still finished with losing records both seasons. This trait of contending well into the beginning of the summer and then falling into the standings became known as the June swoon. Along with Kingman, Cub rosters in this period featured such players as Rick Ruschel, who won 20 games in the infamous 1977 season, as well as Bill Maddock, Bill Buckner, Keith Moreland, Jose Cardinal, and Ivan DeJesus, or DeJesus. 1981 to 2008 Tribune Company era, 1984 and 1989 NFL East champs. William Wrigley's mother died within a few months of Phil Wrigley, saddling William with a massive estate tax bill. With most of his money tied up in either the Wrigley Company or the Cubs, William was forced to put the Cubs up for sale. In 1981, the Tribune Company purchased the Cubs from the Wrigley family for $20.5 million, a handsome return on William Wrigley Jr.'s purchase of a stake in the team 65 years earlier in the middle of another losing season. In 1982, DeJesus, one of the team's players, was traded to the Philadelphia Phillies for shortstop Larry Baal, or Boa, and infielder Ryan Sandberg. On opening day of 1981, only 10,672 entered the gates. By 1983, thanks to the exposure of the Chicago Tribune and WGN, Rick Ruschel pitched in front of a crowd of 18,268. Yet this was all about to change dramatically. In mid-1983, manager Lee Elia was fired after a profanity-laced tirade against Cub fans and was replaced by Charlie Fox on an interim basis. In the offseason, the Cubs rebuilt the starting pitching staff through a series of trades by general manager Dallas Green, who started by dealing for Bobby Dernier and Gary "The Surge" Matthews and inking pitcher Scott Sanderson to complement what was already a good team, boasting players such as third baseman Ron C. and catcher Jody Davis. Green also hired Jim Frey as their new manager. 1984 NL East camps. The Cubs opened up the 1984 season going 12-8 in April, tied for first place. The race stayed tight through the first half of the season, and Green continued to deal for arms. Bill Buckner was sent to the Boston Red Sox for Dennis Erkelsey and Mike Brumley, and on June 13th, Mel Hall and Joe Carter were sent to the Cleveland Indians for starter Rick Sutcliffe. With the rotation set, the Northsiders found themselves 42-34 at the end of June, tied with the Phillies and 1.5 games ahead of the Mets. In a game versus St. Louis, Ryan Sandberg captured the attention of the nation with 2 game-tying home runs off former Cub Bruce Sutter and eventually was named NL MVP. The second half of the 1984 season was all Cubbies, as the Northsiders posted a 54-31 record and the city of Chicago was in pandemonium. The end result was a league best 96 victories and the NL East championship as the team clinched the division in Pittsburgh. In what was the team's first postseason appearance since the 1945 pennant, Chicago met the San Diego Padres. The Cubs' 96 wins earned them home field advantage for the series. However, Wrigley Field did not yet have lights. ABC Television, which broadcast the league championship series, pressured the National League to award San Diego a third home game to allow for an additional primetime broadcast. In the first game of the NLCS, the Cubs won 13-0 behind 2 Gary Matthews home runs, and then took a 2-0 series, leading with a 4-2 win in Game 2. With the city of Chicago in an uproar, the series headed west for the final 3 games, where the Cubs needed only 1 win to make it to the World Series. After being soundly beaten in Game 3, they lost Game 4 when all-star closer Lee Smith allowed a walk-off home run to Steve Garvey. Many fans remember Garvey rounding first after his game-winning shot, pumping his fist into the air as one of the lowest moments in Cubdom. Game 5 was just as bad. The Cubs took a 3-0 lead to the 6th inning with Sutcliffe, the 1984 NL Cy Young Award winner, on the mound, but a critical error by first baseman Leon Durham helped the Padres win the clinching game. The current era of Wrigley Field became a hip place to be, has its roots in the success of the 1984 club. Most publications picked the Cubs to repeat as division champs in 1985, especially after adding Dennis Eckersley to the rotation. The Cubs responded by starting out 35-19 by June 11th, but swooned again, losing 13 in a row as the club's 4 top pitchers all hit the disabled list, and the Cardinals took the division crown as the Northsiders ended up a disappointing 77-84. Shawan Dustin, the number 1 overall pick in the 1982 draft, came up from the minors for good near the end of the season. During the 1986 season, Jim Frey was replaced at skipper with former Yankee Gene Michael, but the team went through 2 more years of poor baseball. Outfielder Andre Dawson was signed as a free agent prior to the 1987 season. Dallas Green was initially reluctant to sign Dawson as they planned to start Brian Dayett in right, but Dawson proved his worth as he hit 49 round trippers and took home NL MVP honors for a last place Cub team that season, the only player to accomplish that feat in the last 20 seasons. The 1988 team under new skipper Don Zimmer, who was promoted after Frey took the general manager position, was the first of a new era in Cub history, as lights were installed at Wrigley Field and were first to be used for a night game on August 8th. The game was rained out in the early innings, and the first official night game was the next day as the Cubs beat the Mets 6-4. The Mets, however, had a 100-win season, and the Cubs, still anchored by Sutcliffe, Rhino Sandberg, and Hawk Dawson, finished in a distant fourth place. This was despite having what at the time was a franchise record 6 All-Stars, as Dawson, Dunston, and Sandberg were joined by Vance Law, Greg Maddux, and Rafael Palmeiro. In 1989, the Cubs made some noise as they won the NL East once again, finishing up a 93-win season with a 6-game lead over the Mets. Some young faces contributed to the 1989 success, with IB Mark Grace leading the team in hitting and fellow sophomore Damon Berryhill providing stability behind the plate for Maddux and the other Cub hurlers. Speedy outfielder Dwight Smith finished second in the race for NL Rookie of the Year to fellow Cub outfielder Jerome Walton, who set the current club record hitting streak at 30 games. This time, Chicago met the San Francisco Giants in the NLCS. After splitting the first 2 games at home, the series headed to the Bay Area. The Cubs were heavy underdogs to the star-loaded Giants, who boasted players such as Matt Williams, Kevin Mitchell, and Will Clark. Despite an MVP caliber series from Grace, and although the team held a lead in each of the 3 games, they were unable to overcome bullpen letdowns and managerial blunders.